When early this week I turned to the readings, I was struck by the contrast between the epistle that we heard from the book of Colossians and the gospel from St. Luke. They both present very startlingly different images of Jesus. In our reading from the epistle, St. Paul begins by referring to Jesus' glorious power. And he goes on to describe Jesus as the firstborn of all creation, the one in whom and through whom all things were made. All things, St. Paul said, have been created through him and for him. And in Jesus, the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. Then we turn to the gospel, and we see this same Jesus depicted as hanging on a tree between two common criminals, being mocked by those who were gathered there. What a contrast. How can we reconcile these two images of Jesus, the divine, the powerful figure presented by St. Paul, and the man in the Gospels dying, being executed on a tree? That's the question I want to address this morning. And I think we can begin to find an answer by considering Jesus as king. What it means to talk of Jesus as king with a kingdom, which is what we're invited to do on this festival day of Christ the King. And in some ways, it's odd to think of that phrase, Christ the King. Jesus never refers to himself as king. He often talks about his kingdom, never calls himself king. The nearest he gets to that is in the discussion with Pontius Pilate at his trial, which has taken place just before the reading that we just heard from the gospel. In that tense encounter, Pilate is trying to work out what to do with Jesus. And you'll remember he ended up washing his hands of him, saying he didn't want anything to do with him. But as he was talking to Jesus, he had the crowd outside. He could hear them calling for Jesus to be punished. They were saying he calls himself the Messiah, the King. They were shouting, "Crucify him. We have no king but Caesar." Pilate's got that chant ringing in his ears as he stands before Jesus. So Pilate asks him, "Well, are you a king?" And Jesus replies, "You have said so." The closest he gets to calling himself a king. Of course, there are other references to Jesus as king in the Gospels. The Gospel of Matthew begins with the wise men on their search to find Jesus. And they go first, when they get to Jerusalem, to the court of King Herod, which of course is where you'd expect to find a royal personage, a king. And they say to Herod, "Where is he born King of the Jews?" But he wasn't there, because Jesus was a different kind of king, with a different kind of kingdom. The great Christian writer Frederick Buechner tells a story about how he came to faith in New York, listening to a sermon in 1953. It was just after the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II in London. And the preacher was talking about Jesus being tempted in the wilderness by Satan. And he drew a contrast between the coronation of Queen Elizabeth and what happens in the heart of the believer. He said, Jesus Christ refused the crown that Satan offered him in the wilderness, but he is king nonetheless, because again and again he is crowned in the heart of the people who believe in him. And that inward coronation takes place amongst tears, confession, and great laughter. The gospel story of Jesus' crucifixion shows what kind of king Jesus is and how we are to respond to that kingship and his kingdom. And the story that we heard read to us from St. Luke is centered around the different responses to Jesus from the characters at the cross. As Jesus hangs on the cross, the crowd that gathered there to witness the spectacle, they say, he saved others. Let him save himself if he is the Messiah, the chosen one. Then the soldiers chime in. If you're the king of the Jews, save yourself. And then one of the criminals who's being executed alongside Jesus joins in. Yeah, he says, if you're the Messiah, save yourself and us. The comments from the crowd, the soldiers, the criminal are all saying the same thing. If Jesus really is a king, he'd unleash his power and defeat his enemies. They all make this assumption because that's what we think kings do. They assert their power and defeat their enemies. St. Paul's, and there are others in the New Testament, are not shy in saying that Jesus has power. As I've mentioned already, he refers in our reading to the glorious power of Jesus. And elsewhere he talks about the immeasurable greatness of Jesus' power. It's not that Jesus has no power. It's that he has a different kind of power. He exercises a different kind of kingship and authority. It's a power, St. Paul says, that is made perfect in weakness, which is why the Bible can paradoxically talk about how Jesus' power is revealed most clearly in a moment of apparent weakness, his death on the cross. His weakest moment is for us a moment of victory. The power of Jesus is the power of love. It's the power to serve, not dominate. Jesus is the King of love. And as we look at the gospel again, we'll see that there's someone in that scene who gets a glimpse of that, who catches the truth of that great reality, who sees that Jesus is an alternative kind of king. When all the others were mocking Jesus, the second criminal, the one next to Jesus, says to the others, "Don't you fear God? We're getting what we deserved, but this man has done nothing wrong." Then he turns to Jesus and says, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." The second criminal saw something beautiful in this horrific scene of crucifixion, which the others there didn't see. He saw a man who loved his torturers more than his own life. He saw someone suffering the worst, yet forgiving unconditionally. He saw a king unlike one he'd ever seen or imagined. He saw a king who ruled a kingdom of unconditional love. And what was happening at this moment was what that preacher was talking about in 1953. The second criminal was crowning Jesus in his heart. He surrendered his will to Jesus the King. He recognized that here was life. And as the scales fell from his eyes, as he recognized this dying man had the life-giving power of God, he knew that when Jesus said to him, "Today you will be with me in paradise," he knew that was no empty promise. The promise of Jesus to be with him in his kingdom still stands. We too can crown Jesus in our hearts. Amen.